Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode, a special episode of Brief Encounters. My name is Federico Barillas, and I'm a program attorney at the DC Bar. And today I'm joined by my former colleague, Willam Xu, who is now a JAG at the US Navy. And we were colleagues before at a previous position when we both work at the American Red Cross in the International Humanitarian Law Department. So thank you for joining us, Will. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Fede. So happy to be back to be chatting with you at this such unique moment in history, I think.
It really is. And that's why we're doing a special episode today, actually. So last week, after months of hearing that this might be happening, it finally did. Russia invaded Ukraine, and it has set off what's the first international armed conflict in European soil, at least since the 1990s, when the war in the former Yugoslavia had some elements of that. So I asked Will to join me so we could have a conversation about what's going on. So what is going on, Will? Like, what should we do if we're going to talk about this legally?
Again, thank you for having me on, and just preface that, everything I say today is my personal opinion and not that of the U.S. government or U.S. Navy. But I think, Fede, there's so much different, interesting conversations to be had about this conflict. Obviously, it's a terrible conflict, and a lot of people are suffering. But from an international law perspective, it's unique. And I don't think we've talked about a true international armed conflict under the IHL paradigm for a while. I mean, truly a state versus state. I think for the past decades, we've had, this global war on terror and this murky gray area, non-international armed conflict. But coming back into this Cold War, even World War II paradigm, where it's clearly state versus state, brings back some interesting issues, especially in the modern context.
It absolutely does. And so when we think about the application of international humanitarian law, IHL, we go back to legal traditions that stem back from at least the early or mid 1800s. And some people would say all the way back to the Middle Ages. But the structure that we have, the legal structure that we have today, is really began in the 1860s and was codified as we have it today right after World War II, so in 1949. And so we have the four Geneva Conventions that really try to address many of the most important aspects of the protection of victims of armed conflict. And we still have some Hague regulations that deal with the conduct of operations, right? And so, as you said, for the past decade or so, a little bit over that, except maybe in Iraq, at the beginning, we had been talking about the application of the third article of the Geneva Conventions, Common Article 3, which deals with non-international armed conflict. But where do we turn now that we are faced with an international one between warring states?
Yeah, Fede. So with an international armed conflict, which this clearly is, right? We talk about what constitutes a non-international armed conflict, and that I think at some points can be a big gray area. But Pictet, who's one of the international, IHL lawyers, was very clear with the one-shot test that as long as there's some sort of engagement between two states, there is an international armed conflict. And so in this case, the entire Geneva Conventions, right, all four Geneva Conventions apply here instead of just the common Article 3 for non-international armed conflicts.
Exactly. So when you look at the structure of the Geneva Conventions, they're meant to apply primarily to international armed conflict. There's that exception in Common Article 3, but Article 2 states that it's any conflict between two states. And it's an important use of the word states, right? I heard in another conversation earlier, someone referring to as nations. And we're not talking about nations. The Ukrainian people may be a nation. The Russian people are a nation. We think of the conflict that is happening as between two of the successor states of the former Soviet Union, not one being any different from the other, if you think about it. Though we've grown accustomed to thinking of Russia as the only successor state, it is actually, they were all part of this structure at some point. But in any case, we have two states fighting each other. We apply Common Article 2, and we know the rest of the Geneva Conventions apply, right? So one important thing to keep in mind here is what conventions apply, right? Not every state ratifies all the conventions. With the four Geneva Conventions, we know that every state in the world has ratified the four Geneva Conventions, but there are additional protocols which expand on the rules of the conventions. It's often the case that not all states have ratified them. The US, for instance, has not ratified either the first or the second additional protocols, but in this conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it happens to be that both states have ratified additional protocol 1, which is the one that would cover this conflict, and it's the protocol on international armed conflicts. So that's the framework we're working in, right? The 4 Geneva Conventions and additional protocol 1. Now, what are the 4 Geneva Conventions? What does each one cover, just so that our audience knows?
Sure, Fede. I think each Geneva Conventions covers a specific topic area. The first one generally covers conduct of hostilities on the ground. So the traditional armies fighting each other, which have been around for centuries. The second one touches more so on the conduct of hostilities on the high seas. The third one on POWs, and the last one covering the conduct hostility as it relates to civilians, which may be in harm's way as wars rage on. And Fede, I actually just wanted to also touch on sort of the issue of states. Obviously, I think we all take for granted, most of the international observers, that this is a state versus state conflict. But as you had mentioned about the Soviet Union, it's interesting some of the rhetoric coming out of sort of the Kremlin insinuating that Ukraine has always been part of Russia, which I can take potentially as one of the belligerents sort of downplaying the legitimacy of the statehood of the other. And I wonder if that'll have any impact on sort of the Russians' stance in terms of observing certain provisions of IHL that apply to international conflicts, but do not to non-international. But that's just a thought.
And it's an interesting question, right? Because you think it may not be the case that, well, it may be the case actually that Russia, as you say, uses this argument that Ukraine was never a state, or it was never, didn't have any right to exist, to treat this as some sort of rebellious province or something, which it wouldn't be, because the Ukraine is actually a member of the United Nations, which is like the most valuable piece of evidence that peoples are considered a state, to own a state, if you want to put it that way, being that what constitutes a state established in the Montevideo Convention, and it's basically having territory, population, a government that controls that territory, right? So those being the key elements. So yeah, Ukraine has had that. There's no reason to even question it. And so the rhetoric coming out of Russia about that is more than interesting. It's a little bit bizarre at this point, this late in the game. But yeah, it's that's a really interesting topic. One clarification probably worth making on the 4 Geneva Conventions, though, is that they do not address the conduct of hostilities as much as the protection of victims of armed conflict. It'll be additional protocol 1 that includes norms on the conduct of hostilities, more or less, but also formulated in the spirit of the protection of victims, right? So now that we have this paradigm, the legal paradigm that we're looking at, what, as we as civilians in a faraway land, or you as a member of the armed forces, but far away, not involved in the conflict, what can we make of the information we're getting, the deluge of information, of images that are reaching us across the web, on television, and so many different sources, social media? That's really why I thought we should have this conversation today. Now that we've created like the basic paradigm, we can turn to talk about a little bit of what we're seeing and helping people navigate some of the images we've seen in the past few days. But before we do that, I also want to mention that Will and I did a course, Born in the Battlefield, a few months ago in the fall, actually, well before we thought this war would ever happen. And it's we'll be making it available again online. And so keep an eye out for it in the next few days on the VCBAR website. And it's called Born in the Battlefield. And it's a Red Cross course that we taught as volunteers for the Red Cross. So, Will, we chose a few stories that we saw online and decided that they make provide interesting points for people to be thinking about the conflict, interesting aspects. And so let's start with one that has been big in the news, and it's Ukrainian civilians arming themselves to fight off the invaders. Where does that fall in the law of war?
I think this is such an interesting story for me because there are examples all throughout history in conflicts where civilians join hostilities in one way or the other. There are these two main concepts, which I think it touches on specifically. One is levier en masse, it's a French word, and one is called the concept of direct participation in hostilities. And we can talk about each of these in turn. But levier en masse, Fede, as you know, is one of those terms that we've always kind of brushed aside when we talk about IHL. It's the idea that civilians will spontaneously rise up against an invader that's kind of coming into their neighborhood. I think during World War One or two. There's examples of perhaps Belgian farmers with their shotguns taking pot shots at German troops as they entered, their towns. But we really haven't seen any relevant examples since. And so we've kind of ignored it, or at least I have, in the course of IHL, until we see these stories coming out of Ukraine today, where the government is kind of just giving out weapons to all civilians, making it legal for civilians to carry arms, and encouraging civilians, handing out instructions on how to create Molotov cocktails, in the home that they can use against the Russian army. So you can easily see a context here where a Ukrainian civilian can very well engage Russians as they come in to their hometown, right? And kind of fitting that description of levy en masse. But again, I've always also thought that that's such an interesting legal concept, levy en masse under the Geneva Conventions. What it says that when a civilian participates in that way, that they should be afforded prisoner of war status, which is to say, again, that they're basically temporary combatants, that they're not civilians anymore, but temporary combatants that are afforded the privileges of combatants, such as immunity. I think it would insinuate that they have immunity from engaging in hostilities, that it wouldn't be a crime per se, and that they would be POWs, at least temporarily. I think it triggers all these questions for me, like how long would you hold them then as POWs, a civilian, a farmer, right? Indefinitely until the war is over, even though they're not necessarily a full-fledged military member. So yeah, I would kind of look forward to your thoughts on that, Fede. And of course, the direct participation in hostilities is just this rule that says any civilians that engage in hostilities lose their protections as civilians, and they may be engaged upon by the belligerents in a conflict.
I guess we're faced with two different topics. And I think the best thing is to start like when we think about civilians engaging in conflict, maybe remembering who is actually allowed to engage in hostilities, right? Who are combatants? Because the law of war basically splits people into those two categories. Those are the two major categories in which people can be, right? And so who are combatants under the laws of war?
Okay, that's a good place to start. Combatants are basically just intuitively the national army, right? The armed forces that are organized in such a way and controlled directly by the state in question, the national structure, if you will. So the National Guard, the Army, the Navy. And I mean, there's always exceptions, but generally that's who we're talking about, the official military apparatus of the state.
Exactly. So that's the main concept. Now, one thing we haven't seen in a long time, but we might be seeing right now as people arm themselves, but also as the government arms them, which is very different from a farmer using his own rifle to shoot at people. People are being armed by the government. Civilians are being told, now you're a member of the Territorial Defense Force or something to that effect. And so we're seeing the rise of state militias. Maybe Ukraine already had its own militias aside from the armed forces, but maybe they're creating other militias now. And at the end, you'll have those civilians taking the pot shots, the levy en masse. And what are the requirements to be, it's fairly easy to know who's a member of the armed forces because they'll be wearing the armed forces uniform and the flag on their shoulder. And if you've seen the news reports lately, you'll see that Ukrainians are either wearing a blue armband or a yellow armband or helmet band. I've seen those too on some reports. But what else? When you don't have those things, what can you have?
Yeah, so there are certain factors that the law looks at. I mean, I think certainly the visibility matters. And when I say visibility, I mean that what you're wearing distinguishes you as a combatant, because the other side needs to be able to distinguish you from civilians. So what you wear, those armbands do matter. And certainly the fact that you're carrying weapons. And I think a big one is the ability to comply with a IHL. In order to be considered combatant, you must also be conducting yourselves per the Geneva Conventions. And that organization is structure, who you're reporting to, whether you fought directly under the command of the national military apparatus. I think that does matter. But Fede, I think in these situations, the line is really being blurred, at least to me. When you take a teacher, when you take someone who was literally teaching yesterday, and suddenly, because they have a weapon and have an armband, do we now suddenly call them a combatant? In other words, if Ukraine had all the weapons in the world and they designated everyone who was willing to fight, a part of the territorial defense forces gave them a gun and an armband, does that make them all combatants? overnight, right? So I think that that's an interesting question for me. I think maybe technically yes, but I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on that too, Fede.
That's a really, really good point, right? Because it happened so suddenly. And like we've seen reports that no man can leave Ukraine anymore. So the men supposed to stay and fight. So are all men of military age now potential combatants? Are they supposed to be treated that way by Russian forces, or what should protect them, right? And I think this is exactly where the concept of direct participation in hostilities comes in, because some of these people will be in one state or another at different times. You know, they might be on their way to get recruited or to pick up weapons, but they have not done anything yet. Have they lost their civilian protection already, or have they not? And this is probably where the concept of direct participation in hostilities, which basically says that civilians are protected from hostilities unless and for such a time as they directly engage in those hostilities, right? And so the time window, the behavior, both looking at the behavior and the time this is happening, are essential, right? And this conversation is one that has baffled legal scholars for a long time, since the rule was basically, it's existed for a long time, but it was codified in Additional Protocol 1, but nobody knew how to apply it during the war on terror, really. Like that was where it became confusing. And a lot of ink was used trying to explain how it worked by the ICRC, by scholars in the US, by military officers. And so the answer has always been fluid, but I think this is, for the first time, we're facing a conflict for which this rule was written. And it doesn't mean that there is the answers, but at least we're not trying to apply this rule through customary law into a non-international armed conflict. Instead, we're going to try, like lawyers will be applying it to an international armed conflict. So it'll be more applicable, and it'll be the actual rule codified in the articles in Additional Protocol 1. But the answer, to tell you the truth, I think this is something to look at. And when you see those videos online, the question will really be, what is happening beyond the four corners of the video? You and I were discussing one video where a tank crushes a civilian vehicle, and it's alarming and it's upsetting the moment you see it. And you and I had different views about it. So what was your view on that?
Yeah, but it was a pretty short video if I remember. And what I saw was a car kind of speeding down a highway, and there was an armored vehicle kind of on the opposite lane. And what I saw was the armored vehicle going out of its way to run the car over. So to me, it was unjustified. It certainly could be a car bomb, I suppose. But we're not in Iraq or Afghanistan. I am not aware of any incidents of car bombs in Ukraine. And so for an armored vehicle to kind of just randomly to go out of their own lane to run this car over, it seems to me to be an unjustified act.
I agree with you, Will. I look at it and I think everything about this looks like it's unjustified. But I am reminded of the reasonable commander rule, right? Like I remember that everything in armed conflict has to be looked at through the eyes of a reasonable commander. And so we don't know enough looking at this video, obviously, for what was really happening in the greater context. But the question for me remains, did that tank commander see anything reasonable about attacking that vehicle, about stopping it on its path? Like you said to me, it's the concept of a reasonable tank commander is there's nothing reasonable about a tank, but except maybe for the people inside of it. But that's exactly what it is, right? And so I was always left, like after watching the video, my first instinct was, this is a war crime, and my second instinct was like, well, what is the reasonable commander perspective? Because that is where the answer really lies when determining a war crime, right?
Just also add, I am not a tank commander, so I can't say what is reasonable. But a tank also has guns. It seems that to run over a car, it's really stretching it in terms of reasonableness.
And it's probably true, though I am not a tank commander either. I've read about a lot of them, but I'm not one. So I'll let General Patton answer this one. But it is an interesting issue and something to be mindful of when you see videos portraying acts that seem like war crimes. You have to ask yourself, what was the reasonable commander? What would have seen? And was the person doing this, acting like one, like the person pulling the trigger or running over a vehicle. And I think it also brings us back to something else about international humanitarian law, and it's that we've spent a good chunk of the past few decades trying to think of war as something that can be humanized and made palatable. And this war that is a TikTok war, a social media war, where everybody has a camera, a phone where they can record what's happening, we're going to see a lot of stuff that is not acceptable. It's going to remind us why we have taken measures like the creation of the United Nations, the drafting of the Geneva Conventions to make war harder, to create more obligations on the warring parties, because war is not a nice business. It is hell, like they say, right? It is the worst of human behavior. So we'll see a lot of that, I suspect. And on that note, there's other videos that have been circulating in the past few days showing Russian soldiers saying they had no idea they were invading Ukraine. They had no idea why they are where they are. And while that may be true, and they were sent there without any knowledge of what they were doing, the Geneva Conventions, especially the Third Geneva Convention, will ask, how are these men being treated now that they are being killed? And this will be true for Ukrainian soldiers being detained by the Russians as well. But I suspect we won't be seeing as many images of that as we're seeing in social media and in news reports of the Russians being detained because they're being interrogated by people holding phones and videotaping the moment and sharing that with the world. What can we say about this, about prisoners of war?
Like you said before, each of the Geneva Conventions is designed to protect those who are no longer engaged in hostilities, and POWs is an example of that. So once you're taken a prisoner of war, you're no longer part of hostilities. The entire point of the POW system is to kind of take the human assets of one side and keep the other side, keep your enemy from being able to use them against you. And in that sense, POWs are not the same as just normal prisoners, say, in the criminal justice system, because they're not punished for anything. They're merely being kept far from the enemy so that the enemy can't use their own men. And using POWs as propaganda, therefore, is definitely a big no-no, right? Parading them to boost the morale of your own troops, humiliating them, getting them to give up, forcing them to give up information. All of those things are prohibited by the Geneva Conventions. They're certainly required to identify themselves, but that's really about it in terms of what they're required to say. There are certain protections like keeping the POWs in at least as nice as facilities, dwellings as your own soldiers, if resources permit, and feeding them and allowing them to exercise. And it's really pretty robust protections if you look at the Geneva Conventions. In fact, I think there's even a provision that provides that they must be provided cigarettes while they are confined.
And
So
musical
I think,
instruments.
yeah, exactly. So absolutely, the some of the videos we've seen are, I think, pretty outside what we would expect the Geneva Conventions to provide. There should not be bound or gagged and being forced to answer questions publicly. I think that is an absolute no-no.
And while certain security measures are allowable, right? Because you certainly have to, when you're moving them from place to place, we've seen hooded prisoners or detained prisoners in the war on terror, right? And so sometimes when you're moving people, when you're doing certain things, you can do it, but you certainly have to create conditions where you're not torturing them, for instance. So I've seen one thing that stood out for me was people who had been blindfolded with what looked like tape, and I thought, like, that must be a painful thing to remove afterwards, but it might be the only thing that they had. So how far does that go? How much does the rule protect you there? It might be something that has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But an important thing is that this is where humanitarian organizations like the ICRC come in, right? They have under the Geneva Conventions, the right to go visit prisoners of war. Like, states should make the resources available for them to go visit, for the ICRC. And sometimes the local Red Cross associations, societies will also be involved in the process of visiting prisoners and delivering foodstuffs and medical aid and whatnot. So that's definitely something that needs to happen. And we've been chatting for a while, but before we go, the most recent news over the past couple of days is about a 17 or 40 mile long tank column that's approaching Kiev and the turn into siege warfare that is very likely to come in the next few days. So we've heard of horrific sieges throughout history, and one that should be familiar to Russians is the siege of Leningrad, where people were starved. But more recent ones in Syria have happened as well by the Russians, or in Grozny in Chechnya. So the question here is siege warfare still legal? Is this something that can still be done?
I don't think siege warfare itself is per se illegal.
It isn't.
The tactic itself is per se illegal, but certainly many of the acts that come from siege warfare can be, right? So I think that's the nuance of it. Another recent example I can think of is Sarajevo, which I think was the longest siege in modern times, and there was definitely an element of indiscriminate attack against civilians of that city through the 3 or 4 year long siege. And so I think really it's going to depend on what the Russian army decides to do in its possible siege of Kiev.
Yeah, generally, right, when siege warfare is allowed, it's not forbidden. It's starving the civilian population, using it to starve the civilian population. When that is the specific objective, is when siege warfare becomes problematic, like especially problematic, right? It's always a horrifying thing, like, to siege a city and shell it, which is what usually comes with siege warfare, is some measure of shelling, and that shelling is bound to hit civilian objects and hurt civilians. But generally, siege warfare is at its worst when it's conducted to starve civilians into submission, because that's not something that's allowed. And also terrorizing civilians is forbidden. Additional Protocol 1 creates more robust protections and more robust prohibitions on how you conduct certain operations. The Geneva Conventions, really, their biggest thing is the prohibition on terrorizing civilian populations. So siege warfare carries a lot of those elements of terrorizing the civilian population. So that's where a state conducting that type of warfare has to learn to balance its military needs with not violating international law. So one thing, interesting thing I've learned is that even though Russia is a signatory of and a state party actually of Additional Protocol 1, it has not accepted the competency of the International Fact-Finding Commission that protocol sets up to do fact findings in times of armed conflict. And so they just renounced, they had accepted the rule Article 90 Commission until 2019. At that point, they abandoned it, saying that it could be misused internationally. So I think that is an interesting development, probably a byproduct of the Syrian civil war, but it's you can see how that's going to limit some of what the international community really can do in the aftermath of this conflict to prosecute war crimes internationally and do the fact-finding about what's happening today, about what led to some of the things we're seeing today.
Fede, I just also wanted to add the precautions are a huge thing in IHL as well, right? And so even if a siege does happen, there are certain precautions you can take that would help you comply with IHL. So for example, one thing we heard over the last few days is the Russians allowing for a safe corridor for civilians to exit Kiev. And so I absolutely think that would be one of those key measures in case of a siege to lessen the suffering on civilians, to have a safe corridor for civilians to be able to continuously exit the city.
Absolutely. There's protection measures that both sides can take, and we'll hope they take them, because it's as we're seeing already, we're in the early days of what could turn into it already is, but it can turn into an even more horrible conflict than what we're already seeing. Will, I think that's all our time today, but I want to thank you for joining me today. I hear you're going to be judging the Red Cross's Clara Barton competition, the International Humanitarian Law competition that they hold every year this weekend. So I'm going to wish you luck with that. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Fede. It's always a pleasure.